So as I said, I want to do something unusual this morning. I've mentioned before a story, In Memory of LHW, by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. This morning, I want to share that story in sections framing the exposition of our text. It's going to take a little longer than usual, which is why we skipped Children's Corner just a moment ago. Begins like this. He began life characteristically, depreciated and disparaged. When he was a white, thin, big-headed baby, his mother used to inveigle her neighbors, "Wasn't it just like that Dulus Lem Warren? Not even to leave me foot-free when he died, but a baby coming." Dulus, in the language of our valley, means a combination of shiftless and impractical. It's particularly scorned. Later, as he began to resemble the appearance he wore through life, her resentment kept pace with his growth. "Look at him," she cried to all who would listen. "Ain't that Warren all over? Did any of my folks ever look so much like a born fool? Shut your mouth, Lem, and maybe you won't scare folks." Lem had a foolish, apologetic grin with which he always used to respond to these comments, hanging his head to one side, opening and shutting his big hands nervously. The Warrens' tumble-down house was across from the school, and the school children shared Mrs. Warren's loud opinion of Lem. The ugly, overgrown boy, clad in cast-off clothes, was allowed to play only if he did all the boring or hard parts of any game. As his speech was halting and indistinct, he was never asked to recite or act in the school performances. He was not smart at his books and hardly learned to read, partly, I'm sure, because the only time he ever saw a book was at school. So he chopped wood, made the fires, and listened in silent, grinning admiration while others spoke pieces and sang songs. But if he was not good at book learning, he was not without achievements. He early grew large for his age and strong, and he was the best swimmer of all those who bathed in the cold, swift mountain stream near the schoolhouse. As a result, he was made to teach each succeeding generation of boys to swim and dive. Even they tyrannized over him unmercifully. Nothing made his mother more furious than what she called Lem's meachiness. "Ain't you got no stand-up in ye?" she was wont to exhort him angrily. "If you don't look out for yourself in this world, you needn't think anybody else is going to." Her instructions in ethics were the only ones he ever knew. For up to his 14th year, he never had clothes respectable enough for church, and after that, he had other things to think of. 14 years is what we call in our state over school age. It was a date Mrs. Warren had looked forward to. Lem would be earning wages, and she could sit back and live decent. It seemed more than she could bear when that same year she was stricken with paralysis. It was the first mishap she could not blame on her marriage, and her bitterness festered. She cannot have been a cheerful housemate during the years Lem was growing silently to manhood. He was in demand as help on the farms about him on account of his strength and faithfulness, though the farmers found him tediously slow, and when it was a question of animals, not always reliable. He was good with the horses, but never learned how to whip the work out of their hide. It was his way on a steep hill with a heavy load to get out and put his own powerful shoulder to the wheel. If this failed, he unloaded part of the logs and made 2 trips. The impatient farmer and sawyer at the ends of his route were driven to exhaust their entire vocabulary. That he was, they used to inform him, the most duelist critter the Lord ever made. He was better with cows and sheep. Feller feelin', his mother said. And he had here a fair degree of success. It was indeed the foundation of what material prosperity he ever enjoyed. A farmer, short of cash, paid him one year with 3 or 4 ewes and a ram. He worked for another farmer to pay rent of a pasture and had, as everybody admitted, almighty good luck. There were several twin lambs born that spring, and every one lived. Lem used to make frequent night visits to the pasture to make sure that all was well. I remember as a little girl coming back from some village festivity one spring night and seeing a lantern twinkle far up on the mountainside. "Lem Warren out fussing with his sheep," one of my elders remarked. Later, we saw the lantern on the road ahead and stopped, country fashion, for an exchange of salutation. Looking out from under the shawl in which I was wrapped, I saw his tall figure stooping over something held under his coat. The lantern lighted his weather-beaten face and the expression of his eyes as he looked down at the little white head against his breast. "You're foolish, Lem," said my uncle. "The ewe won't own it if you take it away the first night." I know," stuttered Lem, bringing out the words with his usual difficulty, "but it's mortal cold up on the mountain for little fellers. I'll bring 'em up as a cosset." The incident reminded me vaguely of something I had read about, and it has remained in my memory. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gave a deeply prophetic answer to the question, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" At the end of those prophecies, he told his disciples that no one could know the day or hour of his return, so they needed to be awake and alert. He told a simple parable of a man who would stay up all night if he knew a thief was coming. "You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." His next parable was about a servant who was steward of his master's house. When the master was delayed, the steward began to abuse his fellow servants and his authority. When the master returned, he faced his wrath. The final parable, prior to our text this week, was about 10 maidens who were part of a wedding. Their part was to wait for the bridegroom with lamps to make festive his entry to the wedding feast. But the groom was delayed, and 5 out of the maidens had not prepared well and ran out of oil. While they were getting more, the groom came, and those 5 missed their chance to enter his wedding feast. And Jesus concludes, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." And in the next parable, the one today, he calls us to serve until the master returns. Matthew 25, 14 to 18. "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away and dug in the ground and hid his master's money." The master entrusts his servants with the money. They're stewards, taking care of and using their master's resources for his benefit and his gain. They're given 5, 2, and 1 talents. Remember, the Greek word talent is purely a unit of money. It has no association with skills, abilities, gifts, or talents. But that doesn't mean Jesus is only talking about being his financial stewards. I think it extends much farther than that, in fact, to all of life. In an earlier confrontation, Jesus had said to give the tax money that is Caesar's to Caesar. His image is on it, it's his. So in this parable, the stewards are to make wise use of their master's money because it's his. But Jesus also said to give to God what is God's, which is us. We're made in his image, and we're to give him all of ourselves. And I think he expects us to apply this parable to all of life. We're to be his stewards and his servants with everything he has given us: time, money, and talent. 2 of these servants do. They invest the money and put it to work. Most commentators believe this means they started a business or bought and sold goods. And they got a good return for their labor. They each had 100% profit. We don't know how long Jesus anticipates this having taken, but they must have chosen wisely and worked hard. But the third guy didn't. He just buried his money in the ground. Now, there wasn't anything like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in those days. If you just wanted to keep your money safe, you hid or buried it. Some people still do that. I don't know if you read about it, but a couple in California recently found 1,400 gold coins buried on their land, worth about $27,000 in face value and $10 million as collector's items. But buried treasure does not usually yield that kind of return. So the lesson of the introduction isn't that different from the lesson of the whole parable. When the master leaves you to steward his stuff, you do best if you put it to work and labor at it. If you take what he gives you and just bury it in the ground, it does no one, especially the master, any good. In the same way, we do no one any good, and we do the kingdom no good, if we take what our Lord and Master Jesus Christ has given us and do nothing with it. Instead, we need to use it for the kingdom, to shine his light before others. Part 2 of our story. Old Ma'am Warren, with her legs paralyzed, did little all day except revile the management of the universe until Len came home, made her supper, and put her to bed. Badly run as she thought the world, for a time, it was favorable to her prosperity. Lem's flock of sheep grew and thrived. For years, no one in our valley did much with sheep because of dogs. Lem's neighbors told him that some morning he'd find his flock torn to pieces. They even pointed out one big collie who would likely go sheep mad. Lem's heavy face drew into anxious, grotesque wrinkles at this talk, and he visited his pasture frequently. One morning, just before dawn, he came, pale and shamefaced, to the house of the collie's owner. The family made out from his nearly incoherent speech that he was begging their pardon for having killed their dog. I saw where he'd bit the throats out of 2 ewes that was due to lamb in a few days, and I guess I must have gone kind of crazy. They peered at him in the gray half-light, half afraid of his tall apparition. How could you kill a great big dog like Jack, they asked wonderingly. In answer, he held out his great hands and huge arms, red with blood. One of the children cried out, "But I shut Jackie up in the woodshed last night." When they opened the door, the collie bounded out. Lem turned white in thankfulness. "I'm mortal glad," he said. "I felt awful bad. I knew you young ones thought a lot of Jack." "But what dog did you kill?" they asked. Some of the men went up with him and found, torn in pieces and scattered wide in bloody fragments, the body of a big gray wolf. The hard-headed farmers who looked on that savage scene drew back from the shambling man beside them in the only impulse of respect they ever felt for him. It was the one act of his life to secure the admiration of his fellow men. It was what he himself always spoke of in horror and shame. Certainly his marriage aroused no admiration. It was universally regarded as addlepated and imbecile from beginning to end. One of the girls who worked at the hotel got into trouble, as our vernacular runs. Everyone knew her and was talking about the scandal. Old Ma'am Warren spiritedly expressed that Lottie was a fool not to make that drummer marry her. She could have if she'd gone the right way to work on it. But the drummer remained persistently absent. One evening, Lem, starting for his sheep pasture, heard someone crying ahead on the bridge, and then as he paused to listen, a splash. He dove in without stopping to set down his lantern, knowing well the swiftness of the water, and caught the poor cowardly thing struggling and gasping in the current. He took her home and gave her dry clothes of his mother's. Then, leaving the scared, repentant child by his hearth, he set out on foot for the minister's house and dragged him back over the rough country roads. When Ma'am Warren awoke the next morning, Lem did not instantly answer her imperious call. Instead, a red-eyed girl in one of Mrs. Warren's own nightgowns came to the door and said shrinkingly, "Lem slept in the barn last night. He gave his bed to May." Ma'am Warren stared transfixed, with a premonition of irremediable evil. "What you doing here?" she demanded. The girl held down her head. Lem and I were married last night, she said. Then Mrs. Warren found her voice. When Lem came in, it was to a scene of furious wrangling, which was henceforth to fill his house. To saddle himself with such trash as you, his mother was raging. His wife answered in kind, her vanity stung beyond endurance. Well, you can be sure he'd never have got him a wife any other way. Nobody but a girl hard put to it would take up with a drivel-headed fool like Lem Warren. When the baby came, Lottie was very sick. Lem took care of his mother, his wife, and the new baby for weeks and weeks. It was at lambing time, and his flock suffered. He ran in debt, too, for he couldn't take work. The neighbors helped out, but it was no cheerful morning's work to care for the vitriolic old lady, and only Lem could comfort Lottie. We did pass the baby from house to house, but at haying time, when everyone was more than busy, she was sent back. Lottie lingered for about a year, then died, Lem holding her hand in his. She tried to say something to him that last night, so the neighbors reported, but her breath failed her, and she could only lie staring at him from eyes that seemed to look from the other side of the grave. He was deep in debt when he was thus left with a year-old child, not his own. But he gave Lottie a decent funeral and put up a gravestone saying she was Charlotte, loved wife of Lemuel Warren. He used to take the little girl and put flowers on the grave, I remember. In the middle of the parable, Jesus describes what happens to the two who put their stewardship to work. Verses 19 to 23. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. It was a long time before the master came back. This is the 3rd parable in a row with that feature. I really think Jesus was trying to tell his disciples, and by extension us, that he, their master, was going to go away for a long time, and that the culmination of things that he had described was going to be delayed. None of them knew how long the delay would be, just as we don't, but they needed to be expectant and at work while they waited. And so do we. Because when the master does return, he settles accounts with the servants. It wasn't their money to use as they wished, and Jesus has already told a parable or 2 about what happens to those who treat their master's goods as their own. In the same way, our lives are not our own. You are not your own, Paul says, for you were bought with a price. When Jesus died for us to win us back from the power of sin and death, he purchased us with his blood. Therefore, our lives are no longer ours to squander and waste. They're his to use. Whether he uses us to win millions to faith or to serve a couple people, to achieve much or seemingly nothing, if we are serving him faithfully, even in the little things, he rejoices. These 2 in the parable are serving faithfully. The first one says, Master, you gave me 5 talents, I've made 5 more. The second one says, Master, you gave me 2 talents, I've made 2 more. The amount you're given doesn't matter, it's what you do with it that counts. So the master says the same thing to both. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Well done, good and faithful servant. I've been a believer for nearly 45 years, and I can't tell you when that phrase first struck me, but I know that for most of my life now, one of my ambitions has been to hear my Savior say, "Well done." Sadly, I know that if he took notice of the details of my life, he'd find a ton of things that have not been well done. A ton of selfishness, a ton of sin, a ton of ineffectiveness. But I hope he'll also find a heart that by grace has been trying to serve him, and hands that by grace have been working, and a head that by grace has been trying to put his word into words. I hope that overlooking the rest, by grace, he will say, "Well done, mostly good and occasionally faithful servant." Andrew Peterson touches on this in his song, "Just As I Am."
Well, it's time now to harvest what little that grew. This man they call Jesus, who planted the seeds, has come for the fruit. And the best that I've got isn't nearly enough. Well, he's glad for the crop, but it's me that he loves.
At the end of the verse, Jesus says, "Enter into the joy of your master." It's not just enter into joy, but his joy, a joy he is already feeling. Jesus rejoices in those who serve him. Just as we rejoice to see a 4-year-old trying to help mommy, or a 17-year-old making choices to put Jesus first, so Jesus' heart rejoices in us. Jesus will give his well done to a life that pours itself out for others, a life that endures suffering and pain, a life that trusts when fear is the reasonable response and hopes when despair is the reasonable response. He rejoices when we point to him in words and deeds, giving him glory as the Savior and Sustainer. He rejoices when we persevere in drudgery and take risks through trust. He rejoices when we turn from sin and step toward obedience. He rejoices when we look around us for something to do and someone to love. He rejoices when we rejoice in praise over his creation. Each of these things, and many, many more, allow his servants to bring joy to his heart. In memory of LHW. Then he went to work again. His sandy hair was streaked with gray, though he was but 30. The doctor said it was because of the great strain of his year of nursing. And indeed, throughout the period, no one knew when he slept. Late at night, we could look across and see his light still burning, and knowing he was rubbing Lottie's back or feeding little Susie. But she was a healthy child, and now she slept through the night in a crib by her stepfather's corded bed, and in the daytime went where he did. She napped in a horse blanket while he worked in the barn, and he carried her up in a little sling to the pasture. Old Ma'am Warren disliked the pretty laughing child bitterly, and for the first time, he asserted himself against his mother, bidding her, when she began to berate the child, to be still, with strange and unexpected authority. Susie adored her stepfather at first, but when she came of school age and mixed with other children, the devouring egotism of childhood made her ashamed of him, his uncouth gait, his sagging mouth, his stammering speech. Though he was prospering again, owned the pasture in his house, and had even built on another room, he spent little on himself. It all went for pretty clothes for Susie, books and pictures for Susie, tickets for her to go to the circus. Susie knew this and loved him by stealth for it, but the intolerably sensitive vanity of her 12 years made her wretched to be seen with him in public. Divining this, he ceased going with her to school picnics and Sunday school parties, instead dressing her in her best with his big calloused hands and watching her go off from the window. His mother predicted savagely that his spoiling that bad-blooded young'un would bring her to no good end. And when, at 15, Susie began to grow very pretty, saucy, and willful, the old woman exulted openly over Lem's helpless anxiety. He was quite gray now, though not yet 45, and so stooped he passed for an old man. But he owned a little farm, his flock was the largest around, and Susie, it was hoped, could make a good marriage. And then Frank Gridley's oldest son, Ed, came back from business college with store-bought clothes, city hats, polished tan shoes, and began calling on the girls. From the first, he and Susie ran together like two drops of water. Bronson Perkins, a big, silent lad who had long hung about Susie, stood no show at all. One night in County Fair Week, Susie, who had gone off with the crowd, did not come home with the rest. Lem, waiting in his doorway, heard the laughing, singing hay wagon in which she had gone pass right by his gate. He called after it and was told, Ed Gridley and she went to the hotel to get supper. He said he'd bring her home later. Lem hitched up the faster of his 2 plow horses and drove to Woodville, 8 miles uphill in 45 minutes. The hotel clerk told them the two had had supper served in a private room. Lem broke the door in with one heave of his shoulders, and Susie sprang up from the table and ran to him like a frightened child, crying out that Ed scared her so. It's all right, Susie, he said, not looking at the man. Papa's come to take you home. The man felt his dignity wounded. He began to protest, declaring that he was ready to marry the girl right now, this instant if you choose. Lem put one arm around Susie. I didn't come to make you marry her. I come to keep you from it, he said, speaking clearly for once. Susie shan't marry a hound that'd do this. And as the other advanced threateningly, he struck him a great blow across the mouth that sent him unconscious to the ground. Then Lem went out, paid for the broken lock, and drove home with Susie behind the foundered plow horse. In the spring, her engagement to Bronson Perkins was announced, though everyone said they didn't see what use it was to get engaged when you couldn't marry. Bronson's father was daft, not enough to send him to the asylum, but so that he had to be watched. He had a horrid way, I remember, of holding lit matches up to his bared arm until the smell of burning flesh went sickeningly through the house. It was out of the question to bring a young bride to such a home. As a matter of fact, they were married that fall. Lem took old Mr. Perkins into the room Susie vacated. It won't mean much more trouble taking care of 2 old people than one, he explained. Ma'am Warren's comments on this action have been embalmed forever in the delighted memories of our people. We have a taste for picturesque and forceful speech. From that time, we always saw the lunatic and the bent shepherd together. The old man grew quieter under Lem's care than he had been for years, and if he felt one of his insane impulses, ran totteringly to grasp his protector's arm until he was himself again. Lem used to take him up to the sheep pastures for the day sometimes. He reported with pride that the old man talked as sensible as anybody, get him off where it's quiet. Indeed, when Mr. Perkins died 6 years later, he had known many happy, lucid hours with his grandchildren. Jesus ends the parable with the sad case of the one who did not do well and serve faithfully, verses 24 to 30. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, still more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast that worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We may not see a huge difference between the 2 who were faithful and the one who was not, but the master does. The faithful 2 went and took risk with the master's money and worked hard at making it grow. They seemed to have a sense that their master will rejoice in their effort. They don't see the master as a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. But the third servant did. He saw the master as hard and unjust and wanted to take unfair advantage. So this servant says he was afraid and decided to take the course of least risk. He hid the money in the ground. Now, there are two ways to understand this in terms of our own lives. At one level, we need to take seriously the master's evaluation, you wicked, lazy servant. So often in our lives, we find ways to make excuses for simple laziness or sinful disobedience. We somehow make it someone else's fault. I would have finished my homework, but Jason distracted me. I was on my way to help, but I had to stop to help Heather. I would have gotten back to you on that, but I've had a dozen people calling me. I would like to help, but I've got so much to do. A dozen cat videos to watch on YouTube, 14 selfies to post on Facebook. As we examine ourselves to see where we fall on the scale of selfless service to the Lord, we need to be very sensitive to discern when we're making excuses to allow ourselves to indulge sin, selfishness, or sloth. On the other hand, I want to take the servant's words seriously for a moment. Even our excuses tend to have some basis in reality, and I think on some level, he must really have felt that his master was hard, cruel, and grasping. That would make a huge difference in his willingness to put his master's money to work. In the same way, I think our view of God makes a huge difference in our willingness to serve him. If our basic view of God is that he's a cruel taskmaster who reaps where he hasn't sown, a vindictive list-keeping God who measures in the scales every word, motive, and action and punishes us cruelly when we even think of stepping out of line, we're not going to have much desire to be good and faithful servants. But if our basic view of God is of a loving Lord who only desires to reap from our lives for our good, and because he has already made the ultimate sacrifice to sow the seed of his son's life to make us his fruit, if that's the God we serve, we may very well be willing to serve sacrificially. In the last few verses, Jesus steps back from the inside of the story and applies it to the lives of those of his listeners who have rejected his lordship and his love. He says, so take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We've heard Jesus speak this way before about those who are rejecting him. He clearly sees that the goodness of the kingdom is being taken away from the Jewish leaders and from anyone who will not embrace it, and it's being given to those who will, who embrace good news and begin to serve Jesus fruitfully. Susie and Bronson had 2 boys, sturdy, hardy children, in whom Lem took the deepest, shyest pride. He loved to take them off into the woods with him and exulted in their quick intelligence and strong little bodies. It was Lem who first took alarm about the fall little Frank had down the cellar stairs. He hurt his spine somehow, but as he only limped a little, nobody thought much of it. Then he began to have difficulty walking. Lem sent for a doctor from Rutland, who as soon as he examined the child, stuck out his lower lip ominously. He called the trouble by a long name and said Frank would be a hopeless cripple if it wasn't cured soon. There was, he said, a celebrated surgeon from Europe traveling in this country who had an effective but expensive new treatment. What did the foreign doctor ask? Queried Bronson, and being informed, fell back, hopeless. Susie, her pretty childish face grieved into a wan beauty, put her arms about her little son, and looked at her stepfather. He had never failed her. He did not fail her. Now, he sold the land he had accumulated field by field. He sold the great flock of sheep, every one of which he could call by name. He mortgaged the house over the protesting head of his now bedridden mother. He sold the horse and the cow, the very sticks of furniture. Little Frank was taken to New York to have the great surgeon operate on him. He is there yet, almost completely recovered. Back in Hillsborough, Lem began all over again, hiring out to his neighbors, only asking enough free time to care for his mother. 3 weeks ago, she had her last stroke of paralysis, and after lying speechless for a few days, passed away, grim to the last. The day after her funeral, Len did not come to work as he was expected. We went over to his house and found him in bed. "Be ye sick, Lem?" asked my uncle. He looked over the bedclothes with his old, foolish, apologetic smile. "Kind of lazy, I guess," he whispered. The doctor was put out by the irregularity of the case. "I can't make out anything really the trouble," he said. "Only the wheels don't go around as fast as they ought. Call it failing heart action if you want a label." The wheels ran more and more slowly until it was apparent that before long they would stop altogether. Susie and Bronson were in New York with little Frank, so Lem's care fell on the haphazard services of the neighbors. He was out of his head most of the time, though never violent, driving his ox team, skidding logs, plowing in the stony ground, planting, hoeing, tending his sheep, and teaching obstinate lambs how to drink. He used quaint, coaxing names for these, such as a mother uses for her baby. He was up in the mountain pasture a good deal, we gathered, and at night. He often mentioned how bright the stars shone. Sometimes, when he was in evident pain, his delusion took the form that Susie or one of the little boys had gone up and got lost in the woods. I was on duty the night he died. He had lain silent all day, and we hoped he would come to himself when he woke. Near midnight, he began to talk again, and I could not make out whether he was still wandering or not. When I spoke to him, he gave a great start, tried to sit up. "Yes, Mother, coming," he called hoarsely, and then looked at me with his own eyes. "I must have forgot about Mother's being gone," he apologized. I took advantage of this lucid interval to try to give him some medicine. Take a swallow of this." "What's it for?" he asked. It's a heart stimulant." His face drew together in grotesque lines of anxiety. "Little Frank worse?" "Oh, no, he's doing finely." "Susie all right?" "Why, yes," I said wonderingly. "Nothing the matter with her other boy?" No, I told him. "Everybody's all right. Here, just take this down." He turned his head away on the pillow and murmured something. When I asked what he said, he smiled feebly, as if in deprecation of his well-known ridiculous ways. "I'm obliged to you," he said, "but if everybody's all right, I guess I won't have any medicine." He looked at me earnestly. I'm real tired." It came out in one great breath, apparently his last, for he did not move after that, and his ugly, slack-mouthed face was at once quite still. Its expression made me think of the time I had seen it as a child by lantern light, as he looked down at the newborn lamb on his breast. "Well done, good and faithful servant."